He had exactly one coin left in his pocket when he reached the toll bridge at Ford's Crossing, and Webb Ainsley stood a long moment on the near bank, turning it over in his fingers before he made up his mind what to do with it. The bridge toll was a nickel. The coin in his hand was a nickel. By any sensible reckoning he ought to have paid it, crossed, and walked the last 6 miles into town with dry boots instead of wading the ford and ruining the only pair he owned. But the woman collecting tolls that afternoon was shivering under a thin shawl with a baby wrapped tight against the wind, and her own boots, Webb couldn't help noticing, had a split clean through the sole that let the mud show through. And there was a particular kind of hunger in a face that Webb Ainsley had come to recognize very well over the past hard year, on account of seeing it every morning in his shaving mirror. "Ma'am," he said, and held the coin out to her instead of the toll box. "You keep that. I'll ford it on foot." She looked at the coin, then at him, with an expression he couldn't quite place, not quite surprise, not quite gratitude, something more careful than either. "You'll ruin your boots, mister." "Boots dry," he said, and gave her the small, tired smile that was about all he had energy left to spare. "Babies need feeding regular. Seemed the better bargain to me." She did not thank him extravagantly, which he appreciated, because a man down to his last coin has a certain pride left even when he's given that coin away, and doesn't much care to be made a fuss over for it. She only nodded, and tucked the coin into her apron pocket, and watched him roll his trouser legs and wade the cold ford with his boots slung over his shoulder, and something in the watching stayed with her longer than she expected it to. Webb Ainsley had not always been a man counting his last nickel. 3 years before, he'd had a modest but growing herd, a small house he'd built with his own hands on land he'd proved up honest, and something like hope for the future. Then the worst winter in a decade had come through the territory and taken better than half his cattle in a single brutal month, and what the winter hadn't taken, a fever the following spring had, until he stood now with barely enough stock left to call himself a rancher at all, and a note at the bank that grew heavier every season he couldn't pay it down. He did not speak of any of that to the woman at the toll box. A man down on his luck learned quickly that explaining himself rarely changed anyone's opinion of him, and he had long since decided he'd rather be misjudged as poor than pitied as unlucky. He walked the last 6 miles into Ford's Crossing with his wet boots slung over his shoulder same as before, his bare feet toughened enough by hard years to manage the stones well enough, and did not think again of the shivering woman at the bridge until 3 days later, when he stood in the bank with his hat in his hands and heard a voice behind him that he recognized before he'd even turned to look. Her name was Corinne Vassar, and she was, though Webb Ainsley had no notion of it, standing shivering at that toll box in a borrowed shawl, the owner of the Ford's Crossing Trust and Savings, a fact she had taken some pains to keep quiet from the town at large ever since her husband's death had left the bank entirely in her hands 8 months before. She collected the toll herself most cold afternoons, not from any necessity of income, but because the bridge had been her husband's last project before the fever took him, and standing there in the wind, watching folks cross the water he'd built the crossing over, was the closest she had found yet to grieving him properly. The men who ran the bank's daily counter did not know where she went those afternoons, and she preferred it that way, because a banker's widow drew a different sort of attention than a woman minding a toll box, and Corinne Vassar had had quite enough attention of the fortune-hunting kind since her husband's passing to last her a lifetime. Webb Ainsley she recognized the moment she heard his name spoken by the bank clerk 3 days later, standing at the counter with his hat in his hands, asking with careful dignity whether there might be some arrangement possible on the note that was overdue against his small horse ranch outside town. "Mr. Ainsley," the clerk was saying, in the flat voice of a man reciting policy rather than feeling it, "the note's 90 days past. Bank's policy is foreclosure past 90 without some payment shown." "I understand policy," Webb said, and Corinne, standing unnoticed in the doorway of her own office, heard in his voice the particular strain of a man trying to hold steady around a fear he couldn't afford to let show. I've had a hard year. Lost near half my stock to the winter, and the rest I've had to sell low just to eat. I'm asking for 90 more days. I'll have it by fall, every dollar. I give you my word on that. Words don't satisfy a ledger, Mr. Ainsley. Corrine stepped forward before she'd quite decided to. What's the note, Mr. Fenwick? The clerk startled, then straightened. Mrs. Vassar, I didn't see you there. The note's against the Ainsley place, 90 days past, principal and interest running. I heard the particulars. She looked at Webb Ainsley properly for the first time since the bridge, and watched the recognition move slow across his face as he placed her, the shivering woman, at the toll box. The coin he'd given away rather than wet his boots set now against the ledger book, and the clerk's deference, and the plain fact of who she must be standing in that office. She watched him understand it, and watched the color rise in his face, not with anger but with something closer to a private and painful embarrassment. A proud man realizing the kindness he'd given a stranger had, in fact, been given to the very woman holding his fate in her hands. You're the toll woman, he said, quiet. I'm the toll woman, she agreed. And it seems, Mr. Ainsley, that I'm also your banker, which I promise you I did not know when you handed me your last coin 3 days back, and which changes nothing about the kindness of the doing, whatever it changes about the awkwardness of this present conversation. He held himself very still, the way a man does when he is deciding whether to be humiliated or simply honest, and honesty won out, as she had somehow already guessed it would. Then I expect you know that was my last coin, ma'am, and I expect you can see plain enough what state my finances are in without needing Mr. Fenwick's ledger to tell you. I can see it, she said. I can also see a man who gave away his last nickel to a stranger with a baby rather than spare his own boots a wetting, which tells me a good deal more about what kind of debtor you'd be than any column of figures Mr. Fenwick's kept. Mr. Fenwick, sensing correctly that he had become superfluous to the conversation, found some other business to attend at the far end of the counter. 90 more days, Corrine said. I'll extend it myself on my own authority, and if fall comes and you're still short, we'll talk again rather than my sending men out to put you off your own land. That's not charity, Mr. Ainsley, whatever it might look like. That's a bank making a sound judgment about a man's character, which I'd remind you is worth a good deal more than most collateral in this territory. He didn't know how to answer that right away, and she watched him work through the pride of it, the wanting to refuse help from a woman, even as the plain necessity of his situation argued against refusing anything at all. I'll take the 90 days, he said finally, and I'll pay every dollar of it, principal and interest both, before the season's out. But I'd ask one thing more if I've got any standing left to ask it. Ask it. Let me pay you back the nickel first. Whatever else gets settled between us as banker and debtor, I'd like that particular account cleared separate and cleared honest, between a man and the woman he handed it to at a bridge. Something in Corrine's chest, which had gone quiet and careful since her husband's death, moved unexpectedly at that, at the strange dignity of a man insisting on repaying a nickel in the very same breath as negotiating a debt worth hundreds of dollars, as though the small kindness and the large hardship both deserved to be honored on their own separate terms. I'll take the nickel back, Mr. Ainsley, she said, when you've got one to spare that isn't your last. Summer came hard and dry that year, and Webb Ainsley worked from before light to well past dark rebuilding his herd, and more than once found himself riding the long way into town, past the toll bridge, rather than the short way past the bank, because he had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he preferred the chance of finding Corrine Vassar there in her worn shawl over finding her behind Mr. Fenwick's counter, where the whole weight of what she was to him sat differently between them. She, meanwhile, had begun quietly asking after him around town, the way a careful woman does when she does not wish her interest known before she has decided herself what to make of it. She learned from the feed store that he paid his accounts the moment he had funds, never a day later. She learned from a neighboring rancher that Webb had once ridden 2 hours in a storm to help a stranger's wagon out of a washed-out gulch, and never mentioned it to a soul until the neighbor happened to tell it himself. Each small fact settled into her like another stone laid on a foundation she had not admitted, even to herself, that she was building. They spoke perhaps a dozen times that summer, always at the bridge, always brief, a few words exchanged while he watered his horse. An afternoon when a sudden rain caught them both under the same scrap of overhang, and they waited it out talking of nothing important and everything that mattered, in the way two careful people learn to say true things while pretending to discuss the weather. She never once mentioned the note. He never once asked her to. Whatever grew between them at that crossing grew separate from the ledger in Mr. Fenwick's office, exactly as Webb had asked it to, and by the time the first cool nights of autumn came on, both of them understood, without either having said so plainly, that something had taken root at that toll bridge a good deal sturdier than any bank's collateral. She, for her part, took to minding the toll box a good deal more often than grief alone accounted for, and told herself it was simply an afternoon's habit she'd grown fond of, until the day in early autumn when Webb rode up to the crossing with his saddlebags heavier than she'd ever seen them, and dismounted, and counted out onto her palm not a nickel but the full sum of his note, principal and interest both, paid 3 weeks ahead of the season's turning. "There's your account settled, Mrs. Vassar," he said. "Banker's business first, same as I promised." "And the nickel?" she asked, though she already knew, from the particular care with which he'd separated one small coin from the rest of the stack, exactly what answer was coming. "That one's for the bridge," he said, and set it in her palm apart from the rest. "And it comes with a question I've been working up the courage to ask you the whole ride into town, which is whether a banker's widow might consider walking out with a rancher who's finally solvent enough to court her properly, rather than a beggar handing her his last coin out of pity." "It was never pity," Corinne said, closing her hand around the nickel, and without quite meaning to let him see how glad she was of the asking, around his hand besides. "It was the first kindness anyone had shown me plain, with no notion of what I was worth, since my husband passed. I don't intend to let a man like that walk off just because his boots have finally dried out, Mr. Ainsley." They married the following spring at the bridge itself, with half of Ford's Crossing turned out to see it, and Corinne kept that first nickel the rest of her days in a small box on her mantel, not for its worth, which was nothing at all, but for the particular truth it had taught her, that the measure of a man was never in what he had to give, but in what he was willing to give away when he had almost nothing left.